to a Gold Institute briefing entitled "Western Foreign Policy and in the Absence of the United States." My name is Ellie Gold. I am the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy, a DC-based foreign policy and defense think tank. Today, I'm pleased with us. We do have two distinguished fellows at the Gold Institute. Jeffrey Van Orden and Dirk Jan Epping. Jeffrey spent years in representing the UK in European Parliament, and Dirk Jan Epping spent time in the European Parliament as well, but now is a member of the Parliament in the Netherlands. Today, we're going to be talking about the importance of alliance strategy and alliances. Dirk and Epping will be giving us an update as to what is going on with German elections and what to expect from there. You know, it's interesting as we look at alliance strategy, something that the Gold Institute is very focused on. And Jeffrey Van Orden today is going to be talking to us about what we saw with the Australia, the UK, and the US recent relationship and agreements with regarding to submarines, and taking away that relationship, or so it would appear, from France. And of course, Jeffrey's going to touch on that. I know that did not go over very well, to put it mildly. But again, it wouldn't be a Thursday if Macron and France wasn't upset about something. But that being said, you know, we take a look, and Jeffrey, I'm going to give an lead in with this, and I certainly want to hear your thoughts on as we look at alliances. Especially as we look to transatlantic alliances. When President Trump, and we have the luxury of looking back at with hindsight, and when President Trump gave that famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, speech regarding America First, and this was at the United Nations, everybody was up in arms. And the idea that the United States is going at it alone, and the United States cares about the U.S. first, and that's what President Trump is so concerned about. What it did was, in my view, as we look back, what it did was it gave a different and a unique appreciation for the alliances that we do have, that we, meaning each individual country, has. Before, there were certain things that were just expected to happen. The relationships were just expected because, to quote members of Congress and others in government here, at least in Washington, and that is, well, this is the way we've always done it. So why should things change now? So I thought that I think that it gives us a unique refresher about the importances of alliances. So this is something that we've been touching upon. You know, with COVID, we were unable to travel. We had these travel restrictions, but now, after a year and a half, we're able to travel, and and we get to see our friends, and it sort of gives us a new appreciation for those friendships. Oh my God, I haven't seen you in a year and a half, as opposed to previously when we saw each other every day. So I think that this would be a good way to lead into the discussion that you wish to have, Jeffrey. Okay. Talking about the importances of alliances, and how that changes over time. Jeffrey, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Eli, and good afternoon from here in Europe. Well, I mean, I think you mentioned the Trump speech. Of course, the shocking thing about the Trump speech was he actually said it out loud. What we all know as realists and activists in this area. Every nation acts on the basis of its national interests, always has done and always will do, but it dresses this up often in more polite forms. And I suppose what shocked everybody was that President Trump removed some of the sort of politenesses and said it all out loud. I mean, I have to say, first of all, I can't foresee any credible Western alliance without the United States. We see at the moment in the European Union, driven by France, the idea that we can have some sort of European strategic autonomy, where the European Union, and let's make the distinction between the EU and Europe. It is not Europe, it is the EU. The EU seems to think that it's going to play some sort of global role that's going to be distinct from other major powers. And it puts the United States in the same sort of box as it might do Russia or China, which I find deeply disturbing. But let's just wind back a moment and look at this whole question, because I firmly believe that without the United States, there is no credible Western alliance. So we have to see, well, what's happened with the United States. I mean, certainly over here, I don't know what sort of headlines it's got in America. This AUKUS deal, as we're calling it, the Australia, UK, US deal to build nuclear submarines for the Australians, has got a lot of headlines, as has the reaction from the French. I should say, by the way, that French diplomacy is characterized by being very angry and making outrageous demands at the last minute. And then everyone else rushes around to try and find a way of placating the French. When I say at the last minute, I can think of one or two European negotiations within the EU where everyone had thought it had all been settled, and then suddenly at the last minute, at the 5 to midnight moment, France suddenly puts outrageous demands on the table, which sends everyone scurrying around, and they say, oh my goodness, so what are we going to do about this? We better give them something. And so having started perhaps with nothing of its wishes, it ends up with sort of 80% of them. And I see a little bit of that going on at the moment. I hope everyone's not going to rush around and just try and placate the French. The other thing I would say is, and this applies to the United States as much as to others, we can't expect of allies, we can't expect loyalty, in my view, we can't expect loyalty and reliability in one area of policy if that loyalty and reliability is not reflected in other areas of policy as well. It's rather like a married couple. If you can only trust one another in, over the cooking, that's not actually going to make a very survivable marriage in all the other areas that you have to deal with. So we've seen, we all seem to have forgotten a bit about Afghanistan. Let's remember, it was only sort of a week or so ago, we were up to our necks in this whole Afghanistan debacle. And again, allies seem to have been taken by surprise by the nature of the withdrawal. I don't think people disagreed with the decision that a withdrawal had to come, but it was a question of the timing, the manner of it, and the degree of consultation. And I think if one looks back over many decades, perhaps, it's the question of consultation which so often creates problems between allies. I often think back to the Suez Crisis of 1956, which some regarded, Kissinger in particular, as the United States' biggest strategic mistake, that it didn't back Britain and France at that time. But from the American point of view, I think what they were particularly upset about at that time was the lack of consultation. They weren't aware of what was going on, and they expected a very close ally like Britain in particular to have consulted the United States. But of course, there have been many other examples over the years where the US has not consulted its close allies. We've at the beginning of the Falklands crisis, for example, we had all sorts of pressure on us from the United States to go easy on the Argentinians and try and have some sort of negotiated arrangement there. We had the Reykjavik 1986 summit where Western Europeans were alarmed that some of the decisions might be taken, and they weren't consulted at all about this. So over the decades, we can find many examples of where allies haven't been properly consulted. Sometimes there's very good reason if there are operational reasons, but I'm talking now about strategic policy. And I think all this just goes to show that underneath it all, there is a lack of trust amongst allies. Quite frankly, the West hasn't been a good ally to some other countries. So let me just throw India into the discussion. If we look back to the 70s and 80s, India would not regard the West as being a reliable ally, and they turned to Russia. And Russia provided that degree of reliability. And the very fact of that relationship with Russia by India, which still goes on, by the way, is one of the reasons why, of course, there's not that intimacy that we would all like as far as India is concerned, because we're never quite sure, well, what still is this relationship with Russia. So just to get back on track, really, I think the Afghanistan debacle it cast doubt on US foreign policy and the American reliability as an ally. At the same time, of course, we've had the rise of China, which has distracted attention, which is while we've been distracted by these other activities in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and of course all the focus on domestic policy. If we look at things from the British perspective, Britain, ever since the Second World War, and certainly now, attaches enormous importance to the transatlantic relationship. Above all else, the need to be almost in lockstep with the United States, which is why we are very hurt sometimes when there's a lack of consultation. Britain also wants to be seen to be very relevant as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. We have historic links in that area. We have territories in the Indian Ocean. And historically, we've had a strong presence in the region. It's a region that we know well. Some also want to sort of operationalize the Commonwealth in some ways, although I would put that in brackets. It's not a strong feeling in some areas. The French want to establish their credentials as a global power and to show themselves to be a key ally. I believe the French are still fighting the centuries-old battle to humiliate England. And I don't think that's changed at all. Some people would say I'm talking nonsense when I say that. I think it actually is the thread that runs through French foreign policy. The EU is an instrument of French foreign policy. France gives the lead on EU policy in those areas. So not surprisingly, when France was irate about the AUKUS deal, the EU very quickly followed suit, and that was a script that would have been written in the Elysee for the EU to follow. So we shouldn't have any illusions about that. Germany now, and Dirk we'll say a few more words about that in a minute, but they're about to have an election on Sunday. It will probably put a red, what they call a red, yellow, green, a traffic light coalition in power. But the important bit about that is it's likely to see the Green in a future more leftist coalition than we've had in the past, with all the implications that that has for Germany's willingness to play any sort of useful role as far as military and other strategic activities are concerned, beyond just trying to play up the European Union. Germany, of course, has had a reluctance to engage in overseas activities, although it has in some ways contributed to Afghanistan and Iraq and other areas. Germany is also peculiarly vulnerable to Russia over energy matters. Germany has something like 50% dependency, a growing dependency on Russia for its gas supplies. And by the way, just on that, certainly much of Southern Europe and the Balkans have a massive dependency, over 80% dependency on Russia for gas supplies. All of the Baltics, with the exception, I think, of Lithuania, have at least an 80% dependency on Russia for gas supplies. So that's another factor that needs to be in the equation. With a new government in Germany, how will this impact on her alliances and her strategic policy? The EU, well, the EU constantly wants to show itself to be some sort of foreign policy actor, but what I'm suggesting is it's merely an extension of French foreign policy, so there won't be anything exceptional. We've heard more talk recently about the EU military arm, the idea to have something more substantial there. This isn't going to happen, quite frankly. We could talk for hours separately about this, and I have done for the last 20 years.
Well, I think we're going to have, we must have a another conversation with our European colleagues about that topic. I think that's going to be.
So, what I would say is, if we stand back from all this, we can see, first of all, the West is in disarray at the moment. And by the way, of course, we've got the good old UN General Assembly going on at the moment as well, which provides an interesting backdrop for what we're discussing. The West is in disarray. I would say we no longer believe in ourselves. We've lost our self-confidence, not just in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, in many Western European countries. We're not sure what values we stand up for anymore. And we face enormous challenges and threats. Pandemics, climate change, obviously, uncontrolled immigration, which I think is a massive security threat that's looming up on the near horizon. This ambitious China, with its massive and growing military power, larger navy now than the United States, although it doesn't have the same strategic capabilities as the United States Navy at this stage. And enormously technologically advanced China, which previously relied on just copying Western technology, it is now proving to be very innovative in its own future technology. A nervous Russia. They've just had elections. Putin's confirmed back in power. But Russia really not sure. I mean, strategically, looking out from Moscow, the Russians must know how vulnerable they are in their far east, in Siberia, to Chinese depredations in the years to come. Russia couldn't trust China as a long-term ally. But now, you know, could we trust Russia in any way? Could we do better business with Russia? And the trouble is, of course, there are different voices on this. The Germans, again, in particular, are very keen to become closer with Russia, and I would suggest a new government will see even more of that coming from them. So this is another potentially divisive feature. The countries in Asia and Africa are just waiting to see how all this sort of works out. Meanwhile, who their greatest benefactors are is a major factor. And we haven't worked hard enough, quite honestly, to win new friends and consolidate our relationships with old friends. We've allowed, through, I think, a policy of neglect, we've allowed China in particular to move in on many of these countries where historically we were their closest friends. So we need to look at that. And then I would come back to the question of public opinion as well. My goodness, we've got a job to do on our own young public opinion, because it's 32 years ago since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So anyone younger than 32 has never known Europe split into two with this communist tyranny in the East. They just assume the life they have now is the normal life. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have elements within our own societies, this so-called woke element that's gnawing away at our own history and everything that we believe in, as if it can all be junked and replaced by something else, we know not what, but essentially it's destructive. And this is being helped by conspiracy theories and disinformation campaigns coming from our potential enemies. So we've got an enormous range of threats, enormous range of problems, both within and without, which impact on our ability to stand firm as a Western alliance to defend our freedom. And that's basically what it comes down to, Eli. How do we give substance to an effective Western alliance that people outside, our potential enemies in particular, will believe in? They will give it credibility. How are we going to reestablish that? Because that's certainly how we were during the 50s and the 60s and to some extent in the 70s, leading up to the fall of the wall and the so-called end of history. But here we are again, and we've got a lot of work to do. Well, so I'll stop there.
No, this is excellent, and I think that I'm going to add Dirk to the conversation, Dirk Jan Epping, if I may add you here.
Right.
And if you can,
do you understand me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And if you keep it to English, we will understand.
I think so. Yes. I won't start in Spanish as last time.
No, exactly right, But I think that Jeffrey gave you a perfect a lead into Germany to speak about Germany. But I think that as I've Jeffrey, as you've spoken, I have a whole host of questions that I am confident that Dirk and you together will be able to answer. So Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eli. I'm also glad to hear my friend Jeffrey again, this time from Berlin, where the elections will take place Sunday, and they are going to be very important. I agree with Jeffrey, everything he said. I have to add that 20 years after admitting China to the WTO, 20 years after, we have now finally come to a sort of a strategic military confinement or containment policy through the alliance that came up, and many people in Brussels and on the European continent were saying that after Brexit, the UK would just be a dithering island in the North Sea, but I was sure they would come up with some sort of a strategy to play out in Asia through all the historical ties that there are in the Anglo-Saxon world, and AUKUS is one of the results of that. I saw it coming, I always felt it would come, and it is there, and countries like India will certainly, I'm quite sure, will also join in, so it will be a very powerful, defense line, and its effect it will be politically important, militarily important. And the reason the French are so angry, because I can tell you, they are really very angry. They are shouting from all roofs in Brussels how badly they have been treated by those British. They have left the continent and still they are messing around with the eternal France. They are angry because they are, first of all, jealous. They couldn't produce the submarines on time and the costs, and they are now yelling around on the continent for some sort of a compensation, which should be European autonomy or European sovereignty and all those things. And they expect a lot of solidarity from all over Europe. Now, this solidarity is not really coming. Germany has to pay some lip service to France. Most of the rest do not really care. Eastern Europe doesn't care about it. It is just a French theater, but France is very angry. It really feels humiliated by this fact. The world is moving out and France is standing aside. Now, talking about Germany, yesterday, my son, who is 16, asked me, has there been a previous Chancellor of Germany? Because when he was born in 2005, Mrs. Merkel came to power. And he has never heard anything about any other Chancellor before. So he thinks she has been in power for a very long time. And it's a very long time. And she has changed, I think, the nature and the character of Germany from a very self-confident country, as we have known West Germany, with chancellors like Mr. Schmidt and Kohl, etc., and Adenauer. These were really very strong leaders, to a country that despises leadership and continues in Merkelism. As this Merkelism has become a sort of an ideology or a way of life in Germany, in German politics, but also in German society, which puts the country on a sort of a neutral status. And one can say that over years, Germany has been neutralized, or if you talk about militarily, has been neutered. And so Germany unwillingly participates in military operations, as they did in Afghanistan, mostly together with the Dutch. Since we are neighbors here, they're also neighbors there, work together very well. And now the question is there going to be a change, or will Merkelism just continue without Merkel? And if you look at the candidates, there is Mr. Scholz of the SPD, the Social Democrats, and he looks to be a male version of Merkel. He's standing the way, he has got the same attitude, and when he is standing, holds his hands in her way. He seems to be a person that appeals to the Germans, like, we continue with this very careful policy. We're not going to mess in affairs outside of Germany. We want to be friends with everybody. We want to be Germans without saying it. So Germany is not abolishing itself, but mentally, in many ways, it is. If you look at the Greens, with a young lady now heading as the top candidate, it would even get worse than Merkelism. Unfortunately, she made some mistakes in her PhD, or she was plagiarizing, which is taken very seriously in Germany, unlike in many other countries. And so she was falling down. Basically, she was dropping in the polls. But the Greens is a movement that comes from the 1970s. I remember it coming up, and got into politics in the federal politics in the 1980s, and has been very influential in the process of pacifying Germany, and to look for a different future as a sort of a neutral country, a well-doer in Europe and across the world. There's always, with the Germans, a very close relationship with Russia. That has always been the case over the past 300 years, in fact. If you look at the Tsars, actually a couple of them came from Germany, like Catherine the Great. And all over the wars that have been taking place between Germany and Russia, the two elites have understood each other quite well, and they still do. They still do. Germany has a special policy towards the East, but it is rather into giving in, trying to appease to Russia, and Russia mostly taking advantage of that feeling. But Russia has a 19th century foreign policy, and Germany has a sort of a wokish foreign policy, even before the word existed. Is there, where are the Christian Democrats? Well, people may be doubting whether the SPD has a nice candidate, Mr. Scholz, because it has a quite leftist party leaders, even two party leaders, of course, a woman and a man, and they are quite to the left. So it may make center voters a bit uneasy, and they would still then stay in line with the CDU, the Christian Democrats. The top candidate, Mr. Laschet, is not very strong, but he has promised that Mr. Friedrich Merz, would become a Minister of Economic Affairs or something like this, important in economic policies, and he's more to the right. There's also the CSU from Bavaria, which is traditionally a bit more to the right. So they may do better than we expect, better than the polls are telling us at the moment. And there's the FDP, which is the Liberal Party, in terms of economic policy, most classical liberal, much more than all the others combined. I hope they do well and they would stay in government. So it's still an open race. Nobody really knows what the outcome will be. But I think that over the past 15 years, Germany has become a different country, has mentally changed. The German youth is basically, you hardly could distinguish where they are from. They are not talking about Germany with a lot of pride or anything. They feel ashamed for their own country, for the past, so it is a country that is easily to be blackmailed, for example, by France, referring to the German past, which the Russians rarely do. But France is completely relying on Germany to make sure that the Germans pay for the French military and political ambitions. And that's what we see now. The French want to have a European army. They always have ambitions far beyond their capacity to pay. So they want the Germans to pay for it. And that's what's going on the European continent.
Thank you, Dirk. Let me ask you a question. I mean, over the past years, since let's just say since Merkel came to power, but possibly before, has Germany ceded leadership to France? Is that what we're seeing? Is that what we have seen?
Yes. Well, you see, in the past, the Germans had a stronger position towards France. And if you look at the euro currency, well, the Germans were never really so much in favor of it because they feared it would turn into a transfer union, which actually happened. But the French always wanted to have a common currency in order to have a grip on the German economy and grip on the German financial policy. And so therefore the euro is very much a political currency, and the French have always been fighting and pushing for more transfers. They now happen in the hundreds of billions for France and Southern Europe to get more money, and for France a channel of subsidizing their aspirations, because the French. In France, the public debt is only going up quite a lot. France is unable to reform its society. It cannot reform, and it invites a revolution that way. And it needs the Germans to really keep the country going.
Jeffrey,
yeah, could I just add one little point? I think there was one moment going back to the early 1990s. When Germany, flush with its new confidence after reunification, decided to embark on its own foreign policy initiative. And that was in the southeastern Europe with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the German decision for early recognition of a couple of those states that were part of
Croatia. But when
they
started with Slovenia, but then once they recognized Croatia, it was the end of the Yugoslav Federal Republic.
Exactly. So there, and of course that then led on to the Balkan conflict and all that we saw thereafter. So the Germans got their fingers burnt by a bit of independent foreign policy. And since then, they've gone back into their shell. And I don't think we've seen another example of where they've tried to sort of do it on their own. They prefer to outsource their foreign policy leadership to France, I think.
Yeah, the Germans are particularly afraid, if I can use the word, particularly afraid for the word Alleingang. Alleingang means you go do it your own, going on your own way. And an Alleingang of Germany, they get afraid of themselves. So they will not do that anymore. They will always look for others to support them and particularly consult France. And this way, France has a grip on German foreign policy.
Yeah. Great. So, you know, Jeffrey, you made a good point, and that is that there was a period of time in the early 90s that Germany did have a bit more self-confidence than they do today. So would we say, as we're going back to some of the comments that you've made, but when we look at Germany, and again, Jeffrey, I'll pose this question to you, but Dirk, feel free to jump in afterwards as well on your thoughts. But do we say, I guess there's two parts to this. Number one is just to clarify, would we say that Germany is more focused internally on itself rather than externally? They just want to deal with whatever's happening in Germany and thereby letting everything else go by the wayside, ultimately giving France ceding, again, going back to my comment before, ceding the leadership to France. But the second part of this is, and goes back to some of the comments that you made before, Jeffrey, is it that these transatlantic alliances that countries, shall we say, yearn for, the transatlantic alliances of old, could that be because there's a lack of self-confidence within the countries and thereby deteriorating the alliances that once existed?
Well, what we've seen, I think, with Germany, the German governments want security for their people, and in particular, that means economic security. And they've always relied, therefore, on the strength of the German economy, and they don't want to do anything that they think will compromise that. And that is the basis of their security. Ever since the Soviet threat was removed, and indeed before that, when there still was a Soviet threat and they could rely on the Transatlantic alliance to keep them safe, provided they pulled their weight to some extent. So I think what the German concern is its economic viability, its economic security and stability. And nothing we've seen really calls that into question. And I think other aspects of external policy, they want to express through the European Union because of that continued this burden of the past, which still weighs very heavily on German shoulders. And so they don't want to talk about German nationalism, although I was talking to a friend in the last couple of days who's a great advocate of Germany leaving the European Union and of German sovereignty. But I think I had, as I said to him, I think that's a very unrealistic policy, because Germany is totally wed to the idea of the European Union and expressing itself on the world stage through the European Union. And so it's a very convenient supporter of France in that endeavor. That suits the French perfectly, of course.
Is there anyone else Dirk, before you respond, is there anyone else that feels that they can only keep their influence through or relying heavily on the European Union? France, of course, does rely heavily on the European Union, but not at the expense of their own influence.
Well, I think you have to make a distinction between what I would call the governing classes in all of the countries and the people. And I think the people often have, in many countries, not all of them, but in many of the EU countries, the people have a different view to their political leaders about the European Union. I think for many of them, it's just something that's there. There's no reason to change anything. Certainly among the Germans that I've spoken to and over here in the last couple of weeks, they just don't understand Brexit. They just don't understand how could anyone possibly want to leave the European Union. They just don't get it at all. And when I suggested to them, maybe there are other views on the European Union, they couldn't really understand this at all. This was a force for good. How could anyone possibly want to leave it? But I think in many countries, I mean, Dirk, of course, can talk about the Netherlands, but in Poland, for example, many of the East European countries, in the Scandinavian countries, there's a very big concern about uncontrolled immigration and the desire of the European Union to have an all-EU policy that would impose solutions, and I have to say the wrong solutions, on all these other countries. So, let's make sure we have a distinction between what the ordinary man thinks and what their political leaders think. Because, and I always remember Sarkozy coming to the European Parliament, and at the Conference of Presidents, he said, which is a sort of a closed meeting,
right?
He more or less said, under no circumstances should we facilitate or allow countries to have referendums on the European, the Treaty of Lisbon, because it would be rejected. And he said, in particular, in my own country, in France. So, the political class has a fear of asking the people what they want on these issues.
Yeah, may I say something about
Please.
Mrs. Merkel, because she is now outgoing, and what will be her legacy? And Jeffrey just talked about the economic foundation of Germany, but Germans are so much ashamed of their past, and they're suffering so much of current generation, or what they have to say about it, that they basically always try to be the good one, the force of the good. Then if we look at what they have decided, and on the three issues, Mrs. Merkel will be judged upon, is basically her energy policy, where she basically abolished nuclear power stations. It has been a disaster. Now they're relying most on coal-powered energy production. So that's been the biggest disaster was the immigration, the flood of people in 2015, where she basically feared the entire Europe, or what she did by saying, we will make it, we are schaffen das. And thirdly, for her own country, Germany pays for everything basically in the EU. Everything the South European countries want and France wants, and the Germans always cough up the money in the end of the day. So this is what happened, and this is how Germany has changed. It is a national state, but the feeling of being German doesn't feel comfortable with many Germans, and that's why they always give in, and they have been a force to be blackmailed, in fact. And this is a very sorry situation, because it applies to all of us around Germany, because we're going to be put in the same situation. If Germany goes a certain direction, we are basically forced to follow. And let me tell you one thing more. You know, if you think the United States is popular in Germany, I can tell you it is not. They talk about the Amis, Amis this, Amis this, that. They have a more positive view of Russia than of the United States. Now that is the way it has changed through generations. And you know, I've been reading the Spiegel for some time. I couldn't read it anymore because there was so much anti-Americanism in it. You can't believe it. And it was very much pro-Russia. And this is the way the entire German public is also informed through public media, television, radio, newspapers. It's all the same. And there is just simply one opinion that the United States is bad, particularly under Trump, you know, was despised. And now still with Afghanistan, it is despised. So Americans should have no illusions on their popularity in Germany.
Well, let me just tell you that Der Spiegel in Germany has nothing on the New York Times in the United States when it comes to Donald Trump. So you don't have to worry about that. But let me ask you, Dirk. You know, the Netherlands is one of the leaders in the European Union. It's certainly one of those who actually are paying the bills. So when we go back to the beginning of today's call, we're talking about the AUKUS. What do you see as the impact that this relationship has in the Union?
I think that I mean, France is now in a state of rage, particularly the president. So some countries will try to comfort France, you know, and to promise help and to work on the European sovereignty and all those things. But I think that will go away because the international politics and the international system is run by power. And the power comes from this coalition of AUKUS, particularly with the United States at the center. And it is the only and the first ring of containment in the terms of George Kennan that is now led around China. And do not forget, China does not have many friends. China is buying friends, is subsidizing friends, but doesn't have real, in cultural terms, friends. So I think that most of Europe will adapt to that situation and will regard it as an alliance of importance, yet at the same time, it will trade with China. I mean, China is there, you cannot ignore it. But the only weapon, basically, the EU has is its market and the market access of Chinese products to the European market. The Chinese think that, you know, Europe can go either way, like a swing state in the United States. It can go either to China or to the United States. I think culturally we're much closer, of course, to the United States and the English-speaking world, certainly countries like the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, but I think also Southern Europe. But China will try to make inroads. But still our market of 500 million consumers as a common market, as it is called, is the most important weapon, but it's an economic weapon. It's not a military weapon.
Sure. So let me ask you this, and with this we'll start winding down. Although for those who don't know, Dirk Jan Epping and Jeffrey Van Orden, when we get together, we can spend hours talking, but I suspect that we're not going to do that today. But Dirk, you and I have been talking about transatlantic issues since, if I'm not mistaken, 2013 is when we first began talking about these issues. On one hand, the transatlantic alliance seems to be deteriorating quite quickly, especially post Afghanistan. In the short period of time since our departure from Afghanistan, I think our relationships have deteriorated far quicker than over the first 7 months of the Biden administration. and certain and I would suspect that it deteriorated quicker, although people will disagree with me, than even the 4 years of the Trump administration. But that being said, this AUKUS seems to be a step in the right direction. It would appear to me, not for France, but certainly for this transatlantic relationship.
Yes.
Or not for the European Union, but certainly for the transatlantic relationship. What do we need to do to start moving back to where we want to be?
You ask me or Jeffrey?
I'm asking you, Dirk.
Oh yeah,
and
okay.
then Jeffrey. Then we'll go to Jeffrey.
I think. I mean, there is not. NATO is not falling apart. It has a unique common command structure. It is a political military organization. It went through many crises. The question here with Afghanistan, it all happened much faster than we thought. We weren't prepared, etc. We all made the same mistakes. But America has the capacity to come back from this. Like it came back from Saigon 1975. It's a moment I even remember. And I think that the question is actually, does America have the willingness to lead in the world? There is the capacity, but the capacity does not mean that there is the willingness. And I'm referring also to the influence of the woke ideology as we see it now, having spread from universities to politics through the Democratic Party to big companies, and basically it's everywhere around. What will that do to foreign policy, and what will that do to NATO? And is there a pushback against that? And what force in the United States is going to resist it? And it has even intruded, in the Pentagon, thinking of the military and how to construct a military force. I mean, all these idiotic things are coming from that. And it is, in fact, it's neo-Marxist thinking, what's the basis of it. So I think there is certainly a future for NATO. I mean, it's very logical, but where is America domestically? Does it have the mental strength to get through it like it did after April 30, 1975?
But do you see? But I just want to add that's on the military side, but from the economic side and that relationship is Europe now, as was discussed before, moving more towards Russia and China than the United States, where before it was heavily on the United States.
We get to a multipolar world, and I think Europe as such, so it's without the UK then in this case, because it's part of a Anglo-Saxon, also political and military alliances. What I think the continental Europe will certainly move more towards the direction of Russia and China. So what you will see in decades to come is a world order like we have seen it in the 19th century in Europe, after the Congress of Vienna, where you had several powers competing, a possible balance of power. And that's the situation where we're heading for. And I think Europe perhaps could be compared to the Habsburg Empire.
Okay. So Jeffrey, but what do we need? But what does the United States need? What does the UK need to in order to see a shift towards the US and not towards Russia? Now, as Dirk says, we are now competing between it's a competition between the United States, the United States, Russia, and China. What do we need to see in order to get the United States to dominate that relationship?
Okay. Well, just to pick up on this point, Eli, and to pick up on what Dirk was saying there, that is why this whole effort on the part of certain people within the European Union to pursue EU strategic autonomy is so dangerous. Because what does this mean? Autonomy from what? Well, actually, what it means is autonomy from the United States. They want to create this third power, if you like. But at the same time, we see the forces at work aiming for the neutralization of Germany and through that of continental Europe. And so I think this is a very, very dangerous tendency. Russia, for a very long time, its main strategic aim has been to separate Europe from the United States. And what we see through our own neglect, in a way, is movement in that direction. The United States, when it's speaking at NATO, obviously it's got to speak as a friend. It has to speak with a certain humility, because even the United States surely realizes it needs allies. No longer is it all powerful and can do whatever it wants without allies on board. So I think with all due humility and friendship, but the United States needs to talk tough at NATO. And it needs to say, we need to restore NATO as the platform of consultation on security and strategic issues. It is not helped if you try and separate, if you try and set up a separate, autonomous decision-making body in this same city of Brussels, while we're pretending that the forum of consultation is NATO. NATO has to become that genuine forum of consultation, and the allies need to act then with coherence. Secondly, I would say we need to extend alliance into other areas of policy. You can, as I started this session to say, you can't expect people to be close friends and allies in one area of policy while stabbing them in the back in another. And we've seen this from the French. They've been poisonous throughout the Brexit negotiations towards the UK and around the world. They have nibbled away at areas of traditional British involvement. So, you know, the French have not been helpful. They have not been friends. And we have a bilateral defense treaty with France and the UK. This is ridiculous, if at the same time they're behaving almost like enemies. So that needs to be sorted out. I would say we've got to do so much work on public opinion, because at the end of the day, we know the pressure to get out of Afghanistan, the pressure to get out of all of these sort of policy areas that we've got enmeshed in, but it comes from public opinion. If you haven't got public opinion on your side, you are not going to have a strong foreign policy and credibility. And as Dirk also was explaining, young people across the continent have a very different view to their fathers and grandfathers about the transatlantic relationship. This is extremely dangerous. A lot of work needs to be done on that. As far as the UK is concerned, well, as a Brit, I would like to see the UK once more becoming the indispensable ally, where others know we need to have the UK on board. So whether it's the EU or whether it's the United States, if we're talking about security policy areas, they need to have the UK on board, but not on their terms, but on terms that we agree with one another. So I think, you know, there's a lot that can be done. Whether there's a will to do these things, that remains to be seen.
So thank you. And this has been a fantastic discussion. I suspect if you both would agree with me, that we need to schedule a follow-up conversation to this. Maybe after the elections in Germany, we can continue this conversation. But I want to end with one question. Feel free to give a one-word answer, a yes or no answer, or feel free to elaborate. I would suspect that the three of us can agree that the Biden presidency has not been good for this transatlantic alliance. I think that it's been quite, in my opinion, detrimental, but feel free to disagree with me. So far, we in the United States, we still have that opportunity to disagree with one another. That being said, given this shift that we've seen in Europe, both in the UK and continental Europe, is there room for another Trump-esque president moving forward? Dirk, I'll go to you first.
I'm still there, Alain. I think the Biden government was very bad for the alliance for all sorts of reasons. The Trump policy, the policy itself was correct. The attitude of the president was not always correct. So he stumbled over his own feet once in a while. But if you would have somebody of a more sort of a balanced nature with the same policy, that would be good.
Okay,
thank you. Jeffrey?
Well, my view is on Biden, the jury is out. Let's not rush to judgment at this stage. And as far as America's allies are concerned, we have to work with whoever is the United States president. We have to make the best of whoever is the United States president. So on that, I'd leave it at that. The thing about Trump, as I've always said, Trump had some major achievements in foreign policy, not least in the Middle East. But he left a very damaging perception of the American leadership and American politics. He unnerved his allies, and I'm not sure we want to see that type. We need to have an American president that we can admire and respect and rely on. That's what we want from an American president, someone who can be a leader on the world stage, but he does that in consultation with allies.
Thank you. With that, we will leave it there. Thank you, Jeffrey Van Orden and Dirk Jan Epping, both distinguished fellows at the Gold Institute. I would encourage you to visit the Gold Institute website, goldiis.org, to learn more about both Dirk and Jeffrey, and to learn more about the Institute.